Hueys were flying really hard, also the Caribous and the Canberras too, but for instance, I think and this is going from memory, the normal time between overhaul for the jet engines and the Huey was about 1,000 hours back in Australia and in peacetime in the US. And we were around about 100 hours between overhauls on many of the engines, not all of them. And at one stage there, we were losing, and it happened to me once, the fourth stage of the compressor would break and the rest of the engine would go out the jet pipe. And yeah, that happened to me, Norm Goodall, at the rearm point at Nui-Dat, backing out the gunship and at full power and still bouncing off the skids, and there was a great sheet of flame past my left ear. And I only had time to sort of stop the yaw and we were already on the ground. And it bent the skids or something. But the gunships were really heavy to go out. And several of the blokes had similar engine failures and put it into the swamp or the beach or the jungle. So you were pretty careful about assessing risk, whereas most of the time you're over the jungle, well, you know you're going to go into the jungle, but you tried to minimise that exposure. The Huey wasn't that, you know, there was this constant push to get more and more power and more reliability, and so when there's a war on, I guess people just push a bit hard, and we were really pushing the aircraft hard because everything needed to be done yesterday. And, you know, lots of cycling and really pushing the aircraft all the time. And it was inevitable in those days that you'd have this, because everything was analogue. So it was hard to get good data and have the time to analyse it and then come up with refinement of metallurgy and procedures for both manufacture and overhaul and operation. Whereas, you know, you look at what's happening today, the reliability and the competence of the process and the people and the machinery, and a much more mature attitude to risk, you end up with a pretty good safety record. But how that's going to be in the next combat, we only know we only got help from the Chinooks when we had to pluck a gunship off the beach or a downed aircraft, and that was it. And they ended up dropping one, I think. But that was just a risk you had to have. And nobody at that stage was, well, they were impressed with the Chinook, but not favourably, because it was having its own issues. And I think the compressor face would depart, or a turbine would depart the engine and cut all the hydraulic lines as it went up the tower, and so they'd end up losing control of the aircraft and crashing. Well, that was the story at the time, and the fix apparently, because of the war, was to armour plate the hydraulic lines so at least you could recover the aircraft. But in hindsight, the Chinook was and is, you know, a brilliant crane and better than the big Sikorsky, because it wasn't as affected by crosswinds and tailwinds. And yeah, so we saw, and particularly the Army saw what the Chinook could do in terms of moving fuel and people and the rest of it. So it was a no-brainer that we got the Chinook. Well, yeah, and particularly pushed from the Army. It was obvious the capability without an airfield of lifting stuff and moving it a lot more than a Caribou, and a little bit faster. Maybe not as far, but yeah, and it just made logistic support of an army in the field a lot, and particularly artillery, keeping the guns up the fuel and ammunition up to guns and tanks, made it almost essential. If you've got an army that fights and walks on its feet, well, maybe it's not so desperate, but yeah, and the way the Americans operate, certainly it was essential for what they wanted to do, and we've still got Chinooks, so good decision. Yeah, I suppose we supported all the units there, and sometimes we did medevacs off US cruisers or Australian cruisers or resupplies off the coast. We did artillery or fire spotting. There's a couple of stories there that I'll come back to in a minute if you remind me. But probably the majority of our work, not 51+%, but say, I don't know, 25 to 45% was support of the SAS. And while 9 Squadron wasn't the only means of them going into their patrol areas, we were the normal means and probably the overwhelmingly normal mean of getting them in, but particularly getting them out, because we were the only ones that could react in time. And the SAS patrols were the eyes and ears of the task force, the Australian task force. And so how it evolved, and it evolved very quickly in the early days. A lot of the SAS and early squadron leaders and so on in 9 Squadron came up with the tactics of insertion and extraction of SAS patrols. And so some days before a particular patrol was to go out to recce their tactical area of responsibility or their little operating area, the patrol leader and his 2IC and maybe his comms bloke would come down to the 9 Squadron alert shack at Nuidat, and they'd talk to the bloke who was going to be flight lead on the day that they were getting inserted. And so often that was me, but not only, plenty of other blokes did it too. So they'd come down and or whoever was doing the job, would be on a lesser alert aircraft. And we'd just hop in this aircraft and go out and have a look at the province without showing any undue interest of any part of it. And then you'd pore over the maps and the photographs and you'd agree with the patrol leader where it was going and what was the alternate if the first preference was unavailable. And so several days later, Albatross 01, occasionally me again, the patrol would come down to the shack and then all the crews involved, so you'd have a lead, Albatross 01 was the lead, you'd have Albatross 02 would be the aircraft that took the patrol, and Albatross 03 would be the spare, and occasionally, not very often, you might have 2 patrols going in and 2 spares, but normally it was just 1, 2, 3 slicks and 2 gunships, Bushranger 71, the lead, Bushranger 72. So all those crews would brief with the patrol. You go out, mount up, start engines, and you'd all fly off together. And then once up at altitude and clear of Nuidat, the gunships right from the start would drift out so that they could cover, so they were in a tactical formation, and the slicks would stay in a finger formation so that they had tactical mobility within the formation and wouldn't conflict or minimise confliction with the gunships. And then some time before you got to the insertion pad, Albatross 01 would send 02 with the patrol on down to low level because we had no GPS and jungle looks pretty much like jungle wherever you are. And so SAS blokes loved that part. You know, we used to call it going down the mine, and you'd see them sitting there with it because there were no doors. The doors pulled back, the crewmen and gunner either side with an M60 and the 5 or 6 or sometimes only 4 blokes with their feet hanging out with big grins on their face. They took this sleigh ride past the jungle. And then as the 02 bird was approaching the pad, 01 would start counting off and giving directions. And so he'd go into the pad, and as the aircraft landed, out they'd go. And then the aircraft, as fast as it could, would roll through and then take off. And the gunships would have been set up on a pattern so they would roll in if they had to, and then they'd continue on. Then After so many kilometres at low level, clicks, 02 would climb up and join the other two slicks, and the gunships would stay in close proximity, and we just go into a holding pattern, well clear of ear shot and eyesight, and wait to hear if we heard from the patrol. And occasionally you would, so you'd have to go back and pull them out because they'd run into trouble. And then one day I was doing it. It was the new SAS Squadron, and he was a Brit, Andy, and I can't think of his surname for the moment. And we briefed his patrol. He went in. I think Ward Rayner was the captain of the 02 aircraft with a patrol on board. I think Ivers Filkins was the co-pilot. And I'm up the top and I'm running him into the pad. And as he's flaring to land on the pad, someone called out, "Enemy on the pad." And so Wood, pretty experienced bloke, just rotated and started flying off. And as he started to rotate like that, one of the SAS patrol levitated out of the aircraft and suddenly realised he was on his own and went into a bomb crater close to where the aircraft was. And I'm about to call, and before I could say anything, Ward Rayner had done a quick 360, came back, and this bloke then levitated again out of the crater onto the aircraft, and the gunships had rolled in already, and then we just ran them to an alternate pad down the way and put them in. But we didn't think they were going to stay out there for very long. And then, sure enough, a few days later, they went hot, and we went and pulled them out. And we could do it without comms if we had to. And I can't remember whether we needed comms on that one. But when they were fighting, keeping the enemy at bay, I often didn't have time to talk. And so you'd come in, and then the patrol would leapfrog, one pair would cover, and then the next pair would prop, and the other pair would come back. Meanwhile, the side guns would help protect them on board the aircraft and then Scarpa.